Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. On today's episode of Podcast for Inquiry, I will be speaking with Howard Doughty. Howard graduated from Glendon College in 1967 and has earned postgraduate degrees in political science from the University of Hawaii and York University, as well as in history and philosophy of education from the University of Toronto. He has taught at Seneca College in Toronto since 1969. He is also a local community and trade union activist and has served as an elected union official provincially and locally since 1975. In today's episode, Howard and I talk about academic freedom in colleges and university in Canada and how that relates to free speech. We also talk about how that has changed over the decades and what its limitations are. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the corporatization of the university from several different angles, including increasing corporate influence, the nature of the university administration itself, and the priorities of companies infiltrating and becoming the priorities of universities. We talk about the changing nature of the students themselves and what that portends for the future. It's a long, discursive, and fascinating conversation. I am very happy to bring you my conversation with Howard Doughty. Howard Doughty, thank you very much for joining us today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Good to be here.
I wanted to start our conversation with a question about academic freedom and how it is either similar to or differs from free speech more generally. Do college and university professors enjoy any special protections because of academic freedom that are not available to most others in the general public?
In a sense, that's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, free speech as we understand it in things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN, and so on, documents that derive from the 18th century, gives everyone freedom of speech with regard to their public and private comments regarding religion, politics, the entire range. And that applies to any Canadian citizen. Where academic freedom comes in is within the confines of the teaching institution and the role of professors, whether it be in class, in research, in public statements. And in a sense, it's a guarantee, a double guarantee, if you like, of freedom of speech. But it is not as wide as some people might think. For example, if I were to start speaking about some discipline in which I have no background or certification, if I were to talk about physics, for example, or Chinese history, and make absolutely absurd, wrong statements, then I have no protection. The protection lies exclusively and explicitly within my discipline. And so if I'm talking about the social sciences, then I have a certain amount of liberty. If I do not, then I don't have that extra liberty. And what it is really an attempt to ensure that teachers can teach, they can research, they can write within their area of expertise without fear of retaliation from employers or, for that matter, anyone else. And so it's a reinforcement of freedom of speech, but it is limited in its breadth, although perhaps a little deeper than most people enjoy.
But that's not always the case. I'm thinking of a particular exception. Noam Chomsky is a fairly well-known human rights activist, has very strong opinions on politics and history, particularly the United States, but also several other countries. He's a tenured professor, but his he got his tenure because he was a linguist and he wrote some seminal papers. And there's, in my opinion, no question that he earned his tenure through his hard work. But then, almost as soon as he became a tenured professor, while still teaching the curriculum, uh, the topics on which, or the expertise for which he became a professor, has nothing to do with the uh, the fame that he has generated and the very public image he has generated over the last several decades. So does that fall under the rubric of academic freedom, or is that simply someone having a very strong outside interest and becoming famous for it?
Like any principle, academic freedom means something only when it is contested. That is to say, if someone makes a statement outside his discipline, or if someone makes a statement within his discipline that people find objectionable, then they can launch an action against him. And academic freedom is the defense against that action. To the best of my knowledge, Chomsky, and you're quite right, he is a very controversial thinker and writer, but Chomsky has never had his tenure questioned. If he did, then he would rely on academic freedom. But to the extent to which he's allowed, as any other citizen, to voice his opinion on political and social issues, to that degree, the matter just hasn't come up. There are, of course, all kinds of examples of people who have made public statements, they've made political statements, and have been challenged. And like, as I say, any principle, it's only in the working out of any litigation that it becomes real.
You write in one of your articles that academic freedom includes the right of teachers and students to pursue the truth without interference from illicit ideological influence by church and state. Now, that's a fairly short sentence, but there is a lot in there.
Yes.
So, my question for you about that is, what if the truth is contested? If you're on the frontiers of knowledge, for example, you're trying to review something that has been thought to be true, the truth might not be known. And so, how can you defend the pursuit of truth when you don't know what the truth is? And can you define for me, because it's not clear, what is illicit ideological influence? Or if it's easier, what is licit or a permissible ideological influence?
Okay, there are at least two parts to that. With respect to the question of controversy and I guess what we could call settled truth, I don't think there is such a thing. If you take a look at even mathematics, physics, and so on, where there are allegedly settled truths, Newtonian physics, we find that being totally upended by Einstein, and we find Einstein being at least partly upended by Planck, and we're only going into the 1920s here. The idea that there is a firm and final truth about anything is, I think, a highly questionable statement. That said, within various disciplines, there are what I guess we could call conventional truths. And those, of course, are up for question as well and need to be. To me, the whole idea of a higher education is that you put everything up to a test of empirical validity, logical validity, and so on and so forth. And we're constantly questioning everything that we say and hold dear. The thing that I was getting at there is that when outside forces, whether they be political parties, whether they be governments, whether they be religious institutions, or just about anybody, when they start making statements about teachers and teaching that are plainly not drawn in the pursuit of truth, but are drawn to oppose those people for other kinds of reasons, that I consider to be an ideological attack. And I guess I could take back my word illicit because essentially I was saying that any ideological attack is by definition illicit. It is ideological. It is not undertaken in the pursuit of truth.
So let me give you an example that I think fits this definition. I want you to weigh in. Last year, the University of Florida attempted to bar its professors from providing expert testimony in a lawsuit against the state, and this was related to climate change. Now, this wasn't mandated by the government. This was the university administration uh, trying to curb the involvement of its professors for fear of offending the state government, even though the government hadn't said anything
Mhm.
about that matter. So, would this be an example of undue interference in academic freedom and in freedom of expression? And has there been any examples of this in Canada?
I would say absolutely it has, or it was in Florida, and there are countless other examples of the same sort of thing. In Canada, I guess one of the more interesting cases is that involving a University of Toronto historian by the name of Frank Underhill. Underhill was a teacher at the University of Toronto in the early to mid 20th century. And in 1940, he was invited to an event called the Couchiching Conference, which is an assembly, a sort of retreat for academics, people in the media, and the general public to go and spend time talking about current issues. Underhill appeared, and he was given the task of talking about the future of Canada after World War II. Now, it was only 1940. The war had not even at this point involved the United States. And yet, when he talked about it, apparently convinced that, of course, the Nazis and the Japanese would be defeated. But when he talked about it, he said something to the effect that after the war is over, Canadians will find themselves in a closer relationship to the United States than to Great Britain, that we would become a continental nation rather than first and foremost a part of the British Empire or Commonwealth. This was simply his projection on the basis of cultural, geographic, economic ties. And when he made that statement, a great deal of anger and anxiety was expressed because here we were at war with Britain against Germany and Japan. The United States was sitting out the war as far as we knew, and to claim that we would become more American and less British, especially at that time, was considered, quite frankly, an act of treason. And those were the words, or that was the word that was used in the media in the Ontario legislature, where both the Premier of Ontario, Mitch Hepburn, a Liberal, and the Conservative leader of the opposition, George Drew, both demanded that the University of Toronto immediately fire Frank Underhill for his subversive statements. That, I think, in Canada's case, is probably the most explicit instance of what you were talking about, and it was direct political interference in the carrying on of academic work by a professional historian, a well known and revered historian, even at that point in his career. So you can take that one, you can take the Florida case, you can take all sorts of things and see that there have been constant violations or at least bending the rules of academic freedom. And this kind of goes back to my original point. Academic freedom exists as a principle, but it's only when people actually make accusations or try to have people terminated that its true importance and its true metal comes up.
So I'm curious, was under did the University of Toronto give in to the demands of the premier
They
and the
did
leader
not.
of the opposition?
They did
So
not.
he so what in your opinion, what is the status of academic freedom in Canada today? You've been a college professor for a number of years. What changes have you seen over the course of your career?
Well, I think you have to make some distinctions between the universities, which have a far longer and more robust history of academic freedom, and the colleges. I've taught in both, both in graduate and undergraduate schools in the universities, and mainly at the college level, and the college level is much, much more precarious. That having been said, I think that academic freedom today is probably under more pressure than it has been for a very long time. However, there's a difference. The Underhill case, the case you mentioned in Florida, and all kinds of seminal cases right around North America have occurred when somebody or other, whether it's a government official or a excuse me, a member of some interested group, brings pressure on a university to fire someone. In the past, these have taken place and they've come to a head in some way over some particular individual and some particular statement or a set of statements that have been made. Usually, it's been political. Sometimes it's been religious. Just to throw in another case that might be of interest, there was a fellow by the name of Harry Crow who taught at what was called United College at the time in Winnipeg. That later became the University of Winnipeg. And back in 1958, Crow, who was a member of the faculty, wrote a note to a fellow member of the faculty in which he criticized quite openly one of the senior administrators and made statements that seemed to some people to be contrary to the mission of the university. It was a religious associated college, and he made some derogatory statements about that. Well, one way or another, this note got into the hands of the senior administration, and they fired him because he not only had made these derogatory statements about one of their administrative associates, but also because he seemed to be religiously incompatible with the views of the university at the time. That kind of thing usually boils down to a one-on-one case. And then people come in and make decisions as to whether or not the termination or failure to terminate was justified. What we're seeing now is something quite different, and that is a kind of, I'll call it corporatization of higher education. We don't find as many people being attacked for their individual views, but we do find a kind of subtle pressure being put on all departments to conform to a number of basic trends. One of them is what I'll call vocationalization. And that means making higher education over into a job training exercise rather than an educational exercise in the broader sense. And as a result, all kinds of things are being removed from or diluted in the curriculum. And we're seeing a tremendous move both in terms of what is taught, but also how it is taught. We're seeing a move towards what are called quantifiable learning objectives, rather than what I guess people could call more intellectual and reflective purposes to the educational process. And as a result, it's not so much individuals being attacked for their personal views, but rather a whole sea change in what's happening in higher education so that we have not the rejection of controversial thought, but the elimination of controversy itself. And although that doesn't attach to very many individual cases, it doesn't make headlines, it is a very important change, not in what people are allowed to say, but more broadly in what higher education is for. And that, I think, is the less adventuresome, it's the less dramatic kind of difficulty, but it is one that is pervasive.
So let's drill down into that a little bit more. I want to talk about that. You've written, and I'm quoting from another one of your articles. The primary reason for academic freedom is the existence of the academy as a place of free inquiry and not merely a corporate controlled job training and propaganda facility. Now, that's somewhat loaded language. Your opinion shines through there. But I'd like to ask you, what is so terrible about job training, grooming students for well paid jobs that are in demand in today's economy, and providing the skills that are necessary to navigate the world that students would graduate into? It may represent a change from what the university or what the college used to be. It's clear to me that you view this as a negative change. What's not clear to me is why.
Well, first of all, I have absolutely nothing against high skills training. Uh, at Seneca College, for example, we have a program in, they call it, I believe, air flight technology. Essentially, what it does is it trains pilots who then go on at some point to become airline pilots in commercial airlines and so on. I have no interest whatsoever in diluting the technological, the vocational element in their schooling. I don't want to have a doctor who can quote passages from Shakespeare, but doesn't know one end of the scalpel from another. I'm 100% in favor of very rigorous job training, if you like, but
Mhm.
I'm also in favor of having a broader education available to those people who are in professional programs. And I'm also in favor of making sure that there's an opportunity for more people to get a not so much a classical education, but a more traditional education in the social sciences, the humanities, and the like. And what we're seeing now is not only a kind of, well, a customer change, and I can perhaps talk a little bit about that a little later. But we're seeing people coming to colleges and universities explicit for the purpose of job training, getting their job training, but in the process losing all of the other qualities that a higher education can and should be given. I'm thinking that what I would like to see is a balanced education, one that has a strong, rigorous vocational component, and one that also has a broadening function in terms of the ability of people to graduate with a certain amount of cultural literacy, with a certain amount of political awareness, so that they can not only perform tasks in the economy, but they can also be participants, informed participants in the larger political society, in society at large. And so it's not so much that I am against vocational education, I am not. Rather, I think the balance between the two functions, the training function and the educational function, has recently become distorted. And it's that I would like to correct.
If I can paraphrase or perhaps sum up what you said, it would seem that the vocational side of the training gives people the ability to answer questions and to get at a result. But the broader education of critical thinking and a liberal arts education allows you to ask the right question or at least different questions and is being able to ask, is this the right question to answer? Is that a fair assessment of the balance you're
That
trying
is
to
a
strike?
very concise and very accurate representation.
Okay. Thank you. I've got one more thing about the corporatization of post-secondary education. I often hear about not only that they're glorified job training centers, but that a corporate agenda is seeping into higher education. So, with more partnerships and corporate sponsorships of university departments, is there a danger of corporate interests creating a conflict of interest that impedes academic freedom? And what I'm thinking about are cases like Dr. Nancy Olivieri. And if you're familiar with her, could you summarize
Absolutely.
what happened with Dr. Olivieri and whether that is an outlier or something that is becoming more common today.
I don't want to say too much about it because I don't know the details, and it is a technical kind of issue. But as I understand it, she was a professor at the University of Toronto School of Medicine, and she also held research appointments at Sick Children's Hospital and I believe one other hospital, maybe Toronto General. In any case, something about 20 or 25 years ago came up. She had a contract with a pharmaceutical company, the purpose of which was to test a drug that they were about to put on the market. And as I understand it, she signed a non disclosure agreement, which basically bound her not to reveal the results of her tests, that she was only to report to the company. And she did the research. She found out that there were some bad side effects with the drug. And I think it's true that the corporation went ahead and produced it anyway. She felt that this was a potential injury to the public good. She made the research public. And when she did, she was held to be in violation of this non disclosure agreement. The university then fired her. And she was also taken out of her positions at the local hospital or hospitals. And she fought at least a 10-year battle in and out of the courts, partly because she felt that she was doing the right thing, and partly because she felt that the agreement that she had signed was, in retrospect, a violation of her academic freedom to research and to report. I don't know exactly how it ended up, other than that she got a significant settlement, and I believe she was reinstated at the university. Just as a sideline, John le Carre, the spy fiction novelist who kind of had to find new work when the Berlin Wall came down, wrote a number of books after that, one of which was called The Constant Gardener. And it had to do with a pharmaceutical company, obviously a fictional one in Europe, doing experiments on people in Africa without their understanding and knowledge. And part of that story involved the Olivieri case. And I know that he came to Toronto and interviewed her over a fairly long period of time. And part of her personal drama was put into that, again, fictional account, not to the service of the pharmaceutical company.
Right. And I believe that was turned into a movie starring Rachel Weisz and Rafe Fiennes.
I believe so. In any case, getting back to the actual point, there are a number of things going on in terms of corporatization. And one of them has to do with the total change in the way in which post-secondary education hires their staff. When I went to college, which is 60 years ago, the idea of having part-time employees among the faculty simply didn't exist. When I went, when I had my first full-time appointment in the late 1960s, I was in a department with 40 people. There were no part-time employees. Now, right across North America, from the lowliest junior college right up to the most prestigious Ivy League institution, roughly 75% of all teaching is done by precarious workers. They are hired from semester to semester. They are given a really low rate of pay. They are not provided with the resources that full-time teachers get, and they are totally unprotected against dismissal. They therefore walk around unwilling to say or do anything that might upset a manager. This, to me, has been the transformation of the universities from the ivory tower to a kind of discount department store institution that is peddling educational products and we are having associate professors effectively turned into Walmart associates of academia. This is the corporatization that I fear, and it's already here. Insofar as academic freedom is concerned, I don't think the people who are not protected by any faculty association, not protected by any union, who only have 14 or 15-week contracts, and who have really no base in the institution at all, other than walking in and walking out of the classroom. These people are vulnerable to any kind of persuasion,
What
and
do you,
any notion of academic freedom for them, especially, simply goes out the window.
so what do you think is behind this sea change? I mean, clearly there's a tremendous difference between zero part-time instructors and 75% of the people giving teaching a course being part-time under contract. Is what's behind that? Is that corporate influence over the post-secondary structure? Is it insufficient funding from governments? Is it simply university administrations realizing, well, I have to pay Mr. Doughty quite a bit because he's been here for a while and he's protected by a union. So every professor that we hire is $150,000 or more with all of the benefits rolled in, whereas a sessional equivalent on contract would be maybe a third of that. So they're simply saving money and perhaps under the idea of being responsible with taxpayer dollars. What in your view is responsible for that sea change?
All of the above.
Okay.
Obviously, hiring 3 or 4 people at $10,000 to do the work of one person who would get $100,000 is a 60% savings. And so, given that anybody who's in charge of any organization is not going to want to incur unnecessary costs, there's a certain logic to saying, no, we'll go for the cheap person, even though that may, in the long run, do the institution no benefit. However, there are a lot of other things. At the college I teach in, something in the neighborhood of 70%, I think it is. Uh, I'll take that back. A significant portion of the college revenue from tuition fees comes from foreign students. I believe the ratio of foreign students to domestic students is 1 to 2. That is to say, there are 2 domestics for each foreign, but the foreign students pay 2/3, the exact inverse, in terms of tuition fee. Now, to me, that's forget it, the exploitation of the foreign student. That's kind of precarious because who knows whether those foreign students are going to keep showing up, particularly in a pandemic. The institutions have adopted a number of business decisions that seem to me to be just a little bit sketchy. And they've been forced to do this in part because the provincial governments in Canada have significantly reduced the amount of funding that goes to higher education. So I can understand the administration trying to figure out any which way to cut their costs. The costs, having previously been borne by the provincial governments at something in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of the total budget, is now down to 30 or 35%. They've got to get the money from somewhere, and they'll do it by cost savings if they can. However, there's also the whole notion of I'll just call it control, political control, if you like. If you have a whole bunch of people who are rather desperate to keep their minimum incomes, they are, as I said previously, willing to say and do almost anything. And this simply means not that they're going to keep quiet if they happen to have an unusual opinion about some hot issue, but they'll keep quiet in terms of being willing to teach anything and in any way that they're told. We then link to the corporations. Now, I don't think for a moment that IBM or the Royal Bank of Canada or any other institution is even bothering to try to alter or create a new kind of post secondary education. What they are doing, however, is setting a model. And the model is one that says your economic self sufficiency and your capacity to produce people with immediate employability skills are what you should be about. And that kind of belief has infiltrated the upper reaches of management in all institutions. So they not only are being influenced or even pressured to change the basic orientation of post secondary education, but they actually believe it. They actually think that this kind of new institution is what they should be doing in everyone's interest. And I think all you have to do is take a look at the backgrounds of the people who are now in senior administrative positions. And you'll find that they are coming less and less from the academy and more from big business, from any institutions from banks to industrial firms to commercial firms. They're people whose orientation is toward the business end of things and not toward the teaching and learning end. And they're simply bringing their natural proclivities, the kind of ideologies that sustain them, into the institutions. And they are doing a very good job of remodeling both colleges and universities in their own self image. So, those are just a few of the issues that congeal to make it, I fear, an almost irreversible trend at the moment.
Another area that you've expressed concern about is the increased focus on STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is definitely an emphasis driven by demand from corporations. Now, from a student's perspective, or someone about to graduate, most jobs that pay anything significantly above minimum wage, a middle class wage or above, requires that you have a university degree or college diploma just to even be considered at the application process. Without that,
Yes.
your resume is completely filtered out. So that's certainly a desire for people to be funneled into the post-secondary school education. These are the skills that are in demand for those types of jobs. So why do you feel an increased focus on STEM faculties and subjects bodes ill for the future?
Again, like vocationalism in principle before, it's not that I'm against those things. I'm all for science and technology and mathematics and the like. But to the extent to which those are emphasized, to that extent also the other portion is diminished. And I'm just not sure that everybody has the same kind of oh skill at predicting the future that they claim to have. When I started teaching, one of the things we were told, one of the things that people believed, was that the new high tech era, and we're talking here in the 1960s, early 70s, that the new high tech era would be a kind of paradise for workers, that the drudge jobs, the assembly line jobs, the dangerous jobs would be taken over by robotics of one sort or another, and that there'd be this grand flowering of creative, innovative, entrepreneurial positions that people would not only be qualified for, but they might enjoy flitting from place to place. The idea of a kind of journeyman worker in computer science, various kinds of engineering and the like, was held up as a model. There was a fellow named Warren Bennis in 1969 who teamed up with a another fellow named Jonathan Slater, if I recall. And they wrote a book called The Temporary Society. And what it foretold was a kind of political economy in which there would be an abundance of creative high level jobs that people would be able to get into for a while. And when they got bored with that, they'd move on to something else. They would be geographically mobile. They'd have 10 different careers in their lives, each one more exciting than the last. Well, about 15 years later, a couple of fellows at Stanford, Levin and Rumsberger, if I recall correctly, did an analysis of the actual job markets, this being in 1985. And they pointed out that the real growth areas were in fast food servers, in bartenders, in janitors, and in petty clerks. Yes, there were these wonderful opportunities in high tech, but they were maybe 1, 2, 3% of the jobs. I would put it to the folks who are pushing STEM that not much has changed. That if we're looking at the workforce today, it is largely and almost, I think increasingly, it's a matter of gig workers in low paid, labor intensive, and not particularly secure employment. Yes, if you happen to be an ace computer specialist, if you can write code to the nth degree, then you do have a wonderful opportunity for a highly lucrative career. But when we take a look at the evisceration of the middle class, when we take a look at all the things that are happening in our economy that make people very anxious and afraid, just getting a STEM education doesn't seem to be a cure all. I'm not sure that some of the things we're facing, which we'll just take climate change for one, but use that as an example of, I guess you could call it a poly crisis. That is pandemics, climate change, economic instability, and so on. In this kind of unsettled, turbulent time, being educated, or pardon me, being trained in one specific kind of technology in one specific area is no surety that you're going to have a future at all. And in that situation, it may be that the humanities, the social sciences, the broader general education will actually be your saving grace. One last little thing on that. A little while ago, some folks at University of Waterloo did a study of what happens to graduates when they go out into the workforce, in terms of things like job satisfaction, financial reward, and the like. And there was no question about it. The people graduating in science, technology, and so on, they were able to get employment when they got it at relatively high levels of pay. At about the age 40 or 45, however, things began to change. The people with the humanities background, with the general education background, with the liberal arts background, slowly were creeping up. And between the ages of 40 and 50, they actually achieved a higher level of income than those in the admittedly narrower professions. The idea being that you get a terrific initial burst of success when you come out of the STEM courses, but they are limited. And the people who wind up being the bosses of these people tend more to have at least a business background, but also a background in, again, economics, political science, sociology, so on and so forth. So that the economic benefit is not as long lasting and not as secure as a lot of people seem to think it is.
Yeah, I guess this comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's the difference between knowing how to solve a problem and knowing which problem to solve.
Yes.
Yeah, and
One of
the
the,
go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the problems we face now is that a lot of us simply don't know what the problems are, or at least how they are interconnected. And we are going to require people who are not only capable of asking the right questions, but as you say, asking which questions to, or deciding which questions to ask in order to solve some of the truly, truly unprecedented difficulties that our whole society is facing.
Yeah, and whereas I do think that post-secondary diploma or degree is a necessary component for at least a middle class wage. It's by no means sufficient. And there was a joke even when I was in university that the first professional words of people graduating from a master's degree were, "Would you like fries with that?"
Yes.
And when we see the growth in jobs, it's a lot of it with Uber or Lyft drivers or Mechanical Turk or uh, drivers for Amazon and so on. And these are, by their very nature, extremely precarious, low paid. And the benefits from this flowering of technology and creativity have accrued to the owners of businesses and not much at all to the employees that make up the companies.
And the degree to which technology is taking over jobs has gone far further than the Ford Motor Company or General Motor Company assembly line. When we see things like be your own lawyer handbooks for dummies and the like, when we see things like medical practice being put largely online so that you don't get to go to a doctor, now you get to go to a computer to punch in your symptoms. When we see law, medicine, academic work itself, as we've seen in the online universe of the pandemic, when we see these what used to be highly individualized and highly skilled trades being turned over to computers, not in the same degree, but certainly with substantial effect, then we're beginning, or we should be beginning, to wonder what our economy is going to look like when wages, for example, haven't seriously differed over the past 50, 60 years, and yet the creation of multi billionaires has bloomed and blossomed.
So let's talk about the next generation. You've written about today's students, and I'll quote you: "A great proportion of people are entering college with total control over the keyboard and the internet, but little capacity to write a grammatically correct sentence, much less a complete paragraph." Now, I trust in your experience, but I have to say this reminds me a little bit of Socrates. So let me. I want to quote him. "The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when the elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teachers." So, my question to you is: are today's undergrads genuinely less literate than previous generations, or is this just a college professor's version of "get off of my lawns, you darn kids"?
I keep very close to me at all times a little statement that was made. I don't know by whom and I don't know where I picked it up, but it's very simple. It says, the older we get, the better we were. And I struggle with this a great deal because when I was young, we were doing things like, I don't know, having a counterculture. We were the 60s. We were rebelling. We were demanding various things of our teachers in universities. And among those things were, the overthrow of the old canon of the dead white males and relevant education and so on and so forth. We were passionate about the early stages of feminism, the early stages of racial justice, and particularly about foreign wars. And so I wonder if we looked any different to the generations that preceded us than the students today look to people my age or even yours. And I think the answer to that is yes, there was a difference because we were more, and I don't want to overstate this because an awful lot of us weren't, but we were more active, we were more engaged as at least potential citizens, and we were driven by a kind of interest in social change that must have annoyed our elders. My concern about the younger people today is not so much that they are, as Socrates would have said, annoying little brats who don't know their place, but rather that they know their place all too well, that they are far too easily influenced and far less engaged in what their society is actually presenting them with. Yes, they do have a certain amount of disrespect, but it is a kind of negative disrespect. In our case, we were seeing something that we didn't like and trying to change it. Today, with all due respect to Greta Thunberg and really interesting folks who are talking about oh, global climate and the like. Many of them are retreating, and I use the word advisedly. They are retreating into anxiety. They are suffering, genuinely suffering, from various mental disorders. There is an increased rate of suicide. They are alone and lonely and sad and angry, and they don't see much of a way out. And so their enthusiasms are, in many, many cases, diluted and diverted into the purely personal. And I have no end of sympathy, maybe not so much empathy, but sympathy for younger people today who, for the first time, at least in a couple of centuries, certainly the first time in the last century, are looking forward to living a life that is less prosperous, less secure, probably less happy than their parents. They are depressed, they are resigned, and they are cynical in a way that doesn't say, and therefore I rebel. They are cynical in a way that says, okay, I'll go along with this because I have no alternative. And it is the you have no choice mentality that really, to me, is the differing characteristic of people in their 20s today.
Is that because things like depression and mental illness are more visible and more talked about today than before, or is that because it is, as you're saying, more prevalent? I haven't been on a university campus in quite a while, but I see things recently like Black Lives Matter and the fact that Ryerson University will be changing its name to something yet to be announced, which is largely due to the very vocal activism of the student body. We hear uh, people describing themselves as woke, both on campus and off, as in a positive sense, saying that they are seeking social justice, as well as a dismissive sense of being oversensitive, but it's clearly a significant part of the movement. So, are people truly retreating on campus, as you say, or are we simply more aware of the fact that there is a non trivial percentage that is doing so? I don't have the perspective of being on campus. I'd like but I do want to challenge this idea that that students are not challenging the uh, central tenets of power and the structures that are currently in place.
There's certainly some of that, probably a great deal of that, maybe more in the United States than here. I just can't say that for sure. But what bothers me is the large number of people who are not in that, for lack of a better word, I'll call it that radical category. And even for those who are, I'm bothered by the idea that they are more worried about identity issues than they are about what I think are larger, more important social structural issues. And by that, I'll simply say this: their demands might very well be realized if things like racial discrimination, if things like sexual discrimination were reduced. That's where they focus. But they might also, a part of that might also be that if people of color, if women, and so on, were treated more fairly and therefore elevated in the corporate hierarchies, so that there would be an even distribution of all kinds of folks at the top, middle, and lower layers, they might find that an acceptable outcome. And I think that's just a little bit off kilter. Yes, of course, identity issues, whether sexual orientation, whether national origin, so on and so forth, are important in terms of discrimination within the system. The system remains the same. And if you happen to have a colorblind, gender neutral system of exploitation, you've still got a system of exploitation. And so that's one of the themes I would put forward. The other one is this. Back at the turn of the previous century, I think it's probably fair to say that not more than 15%, and probably not close to that even, of people in Canada graduated from high school and went on to, at that time, a university. By the mid-century, we had woke to the idea that it was no longer enough simply to have a significant muscle mass in your upper body to get a decent job, that you had to have a brain to sit on top of it. And so we went into a period of what was called mass education. Instead of 15%, we were now thinking in terms of 50% of people could go on to a post-secondary experience. And now, as we enter the 21st century, we've gone full circle and we expect not everybody, but almost everybody to at least have some kind of post-secondary education, training, call it what you will, so that an idea of 85% of the population getting some kind of certification after high school is certainly not out of consideration. As a matter of fact, Canada some years ago became the first country in the world to have more than 50% of its citizens age 24 to 35 with some kind of certificate, diploma, degree, whatever. Here's the problem. What about those young people who have not developed scholarly skills, who have not developed things like even basic time management skills in their time of high school, and yet are not only expected to go, but are actually going to a college or a university for some purpose? When they arrive, and this I think I can say on the basis of personal experience, when they arrive, they are not prepared. They are not prepared for genuine college level work. And when I said something about not being able to construct a coherent grammatical paragraph, I am very serious about that. They are not academically literate, yet they are in academic institutions. And so there's a disconnect. And one of the ways in which colleges and universities are coping with it, because heaven forbid that we have a high attrition rate and a lot of dropouts, we have to keep the student count up in order to keep earning those dollars. What we find is that the curriculum is not adapted to their needs, but simply reduced. To give you just two little examples, when I started, every student in what was then a 3-year college diploma program was required to take a minimum of 12 courses in, I'll just call it liberal arts. Now they take 3. And the time in class has been reduced from 80 hours a semester to 36. And we are constantly being admonished to, whenever there's a sign of a problem, teach less. And when we're handing out assignments, demand less. Why is that? Because we need to keep the numbers up. This does no good for the student, and it does no good for the institution. Ultimately, it does no good for society. And so, what I'm currently trying to figure out is what the heck is a college or a university education for, when the academic quality is not in all cases, obviously, and there's still that 15% who are at the top of their game. But for many, many of the people, a significant mass of people who are in college, they're there because they think they need to be. They have been promised some kind of reward. They expect a reward, but they have not been taught how to go about the process. And especially when you're dealing with 75% of the faculty being themselves contract workers, they're not being brought into a culture of higher education. They're being brought into a series of transactional activities in which they pay their tuition and expect a grade of A if they do all the work, no matter how well they do it. And that's a fraud. Quite frankly, it's a fraud on everyone.
Right. And I guess that it brings back the corporatization theme that we talked about earlier, where the customer is always right. Here we're seeing, like, what you're describing is that because students are paying the money, they are entitled to a degree, and the universities and colleges,
Mhm.
again, from what you're saying, are bending over backwards to ensure that everyone who everyone who is admitted into the post-secondary system graduates from it with the degree or diploma that they wanted to that they that,
Yeah,
that, that they that they studied.
yeah. There's still a significant dropout rate, but it's people dropping out not because, certainly not because they're incapable. They're largely quite capable. It's not because they're incapable of doing the work and doing it to a decent standard, but it's because they become disillusioned. They see that what's going on is a kind of a shell game, and many of them simply lose interest. They're not being challenged to the degree to which they might be, and they're worried that they're just wasting time. So
So
they
you're
do
saying
make
that
their
in catering to the people at the low end of academic achievement that are in the post-secondary system, universities and colleges are losing out of the potential extremely high achievers because they're not getting what they need or what they're looking for.
I don't want to put it that way
Okay.
because I don't see the people who are low achievers. Some of them are probably the brightest students we have, but I don't see the problem as being one of low achievement so much as being the disconnect between what is being offered to them and what they actually need, and what, perhaps if they had a little more experience, what they would be more articulate in saying that they wanted. I think
So
that
tell me can you be more explicit about the nature of that disconnect? What is it that they're being offered versus what they need?
I think what they need is I'll go back to it, a fairly strong general education background that they have not had in high schools. They need a background that says, here you are, this is what you are, this is the society you are living in, and here are the problems that we face. And the answers that we're going to be able to give you are incomplete. They are not in any way finally truthful, but they will get you to thinking about your place in society and how you can maximize your own potential within society. And that kind of increase in cultural awareness, social awareness, individual awareness is something that has to be rebuilt into young people today to some significant degree so that they can see a relevance to their own lives within the larger society and not feel as powerless as they do.
Well, that's an interesting juxtaposition because telling people, giving them, giving students perspective that is much broader than perhaps they came in with can be deeply unsettling. So if you're looking for them not to feel powerless or not to feel depressed, I agree that what you're proposing would probably be beneficial in the long run, but that there could be quite a period of exacerbating those feelings of insecurity. I'd like your perspective on essentially the professor's role in taking into account causing offense or causing distress in their students. And I'll give a slightly different example, but there may be other things. Uh, a fervent young Earth creationist might feel and claim emotional harm if an astronomy professor stated that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old because the student genuinely believes that it's on the order of 6,000. Uh, should the sincerely held beliefs of the students or the sincerely held identity that a student adheres to uh, matter in how a course is taught and what a professor is able to and should teach?
I think it is wrong to lie to students. And if a student is a genuine biblical fundamentalist or whatever the phrase might be, then you shouldn't hold back as an astronomy professor and say, well, on the one hand, it could be 6,000, on the other hand, it could be however many millions or billions. I don't see that the student is served when that kind of compromise is made. At the same time, I don't think that it's appropriate to beat them over the head and say, no, you little fool. Obviously, your religion is a lot of lies and mythologies and claptrap, and I am now going to tell you the truth, and you will believe that as fervently as you used to believe your old ideas. That doesn't work. But I think what has to happen, and I guess Socrates can be used as well as anyone, uh, you have to approach it in a matter of, or in the fashion of questioning, inviting the student to question in light of the following information, in light of the following data. Do you think that it is possible that you could just be wrong in the facts of the matter, even though your religious background has obviously some sort of cultural validity to it? We just have to see where the differences lie and whether they matter, where the differences lie between empirical scientific reality and the moral tenor of the kinds of spiritual or other beliefs that you hold. Um, what happens when they are in tension, and what happens when you see that there are faults on either side? How do you resolve these? Always put it in terms of questions for them to think about themselves. That doesn't mean that at the end of a 4 year program in biology, someone should graduate who explicitly rejects some version of biological evolution and speaks in terms of Adam, Eve, ribs, and whatever other things were said in Genesis about the origin of humankind. But it does mean that you can at least give them the opportunity in the meantime, as a sort of transition, to consider that there are different ways of thinking. There is a religious way of thinking, there is a scientific way of thinking, and they don't have to be in conflict. One of the problems, of course, is that we very often set up a situation in which the students are exposed to what appear to be conflicting truths. And in fact, they're simply truths, or at least attempts at truths, on different levels of reality, different levels of thinking. And I've found, because I've had my share of people, not so much on the evolution issue, but on all sorts of other issues. I've had people who have absolutely resented certain kinds of propositions that I put forward in class. And you get nowhere if you simply say, you're wrong, I'm right. But you do get somewhere if you say different perspectives. Explore them both, see which ones can fit with one another, see which ones are actually in contradiction to one another, and make an informed choice. But it's the notion of informed choice rather than black versus white that will actually allow you to contribute to, never to force, never to create in them, but to contribute to their own evolution in thinking. And that to me is what the essence of real education winds up boiling down to.
So establish the common ground and points of agreement and why, and only then do you move on to where your perspectives may differ and coming to differing conclusions.
Sure. Uh, I don't know if there's any truth to this at all, but I am told by people who claim to know that roughly 50% of the scientists currently operating in North America actually do have a religious faith. So if you put up the model of science versus religion, for example, you're automatically not only losing the 50% on the one side that you're trying to convince, but you're losing the other 50% of the true believers who will no longer talk to those who live in this, to me, world of mythology. If you can show that there is a scientific reality, there is also a metaphysical domain, and that the two oftentimes don't even have to come in contact, but certainly don't have to come in conflict with one another, except perhaps as a last resort in some unusual cases. But they can coexist. They can coexist quite nicely, provided that you're willing to give the other side its due, its turf. I'm not sure that I would persuade very many people who are more scholarly and advanced in these areas than I am, but the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book in which I believe was called, it's now just escaped me, Rocks of Ages, in which he attempted to establish a distinction between what could loosely be called the moral, ethical, theological universe of belief and the scientific, empirical universe of fact. Gould, of course, was an outright atheist, of course, but he also was one of the very few people of Jewish background who insisted on participating in Christmas celebrations, including, for he had a rather decent voice, the singing each Christmas Eve of the Messiah. And he saw no contradiction. There was a moral domain, there was a scientific domain. They were two, in his words, magisteria, areas of knowledge, areas of understanding. They addressed different sorts of issues, facts on the ground, and eternal questions of truth, goodness, and the like. There was no need for either of them to conflict. You could be a perfectly fine atheist and engage in meaningful discussion of the purpose of life, the meaning of life, ethics, morality, and so on and so forth. And likewise, the person who was of a religious background could accept the realities of science. I think we're coming to that slowly. If I'm not mistaken, it was Pope John Paul II who, within 6 years, had not only absolved Galileo of guilt, but also Darwin. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, both of those issues, the, uh, the heresy of Galileo in the 1600s and the apparent heresy of Charles Darwin and evolution in the 1900s, pardon me, in the 1800s, were both deemed by the Roman Catholic Church to be perfectly acceptable and consistent with their doctrines. If they can do it, why not us?
Well, there's I think that of course you can have a conversation about morality, and there's no contradiction in being an atheist and enjoying the music and art associated with Christmas, even
Mhm.
hymns proclaiming God of whatever faith you might appreciate the music, and there's no contradiction between your lack of belief or and uh, and the songs, hymns, prayers proclaiming the greatness of God. And as long as both sides are willing to respect the boundaries of these differing magisteria, I think that there can be compatibility. But the problem, I think, arises when those boundaries are not respected, and the remit of science is ever growing. Our knowledge is growing. So what we claim as knowledge on pretty solid foundation, if not absolute truth, is 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 growing significantly. And on the other side, so that often goes into areas that previously were the domain of faith or religion because it was unknown. And on the other side, you have religion, which is not simply saying this is what is good, this is what is moral, this is a metaphysical truth, but saying no, the origin of life is God, which created all life on the planet in 6 days. The theory of evolution is false, and we forbid the teaching of it in schools. Or because they lost that websuit or lost those lawsuits in Canada and in the United States, we demand equal time for intelligent design or for the theory of creationism alongside the theory of evolution. And there's a lot of push from the from one magisteria into the other one. We cannot allow people of the same sex to marry because
Mhm.
it violates what is written in our sacred scroll. And whereas a different perspective might say that people are people, and if they want to live together, we should not stand in their way, and we should actually grant them the same rights and privileges as two people of the opposite sex that want to spend their lives together. So what happens when there isn't an agreement on the boundaries between these magisteria, where I think Noma Gould used the term non-overlapping magisteria, and not that seems fine if that were true, but that does not really seem to be the case in society today.
It's rather like academic freedom. In principle, it would be nice if the two magisteria could be kept separate without having one tread on the other's territory. It would be nice if academic freedom could exist as a principle in reality, but we only find it tested when someone objects to what someone else says. And then it's a question of having the fight, whether it's in civil litigation or just in, well, I guess one could say within the confines of the university. More often than not, it may involve something a little more desperate, as within the United States right now, when they're having this tremendous kerfuffle over critical race theory, and you see even local school boards being invaded by people with MAGA hats and signs and whatnot, saying all sorts of nasty things. about the communists and the atheists and who knows who are trying to make white people feel guilt. All of that, I think, is a symptom of a more serious problem. But when it comes down to the final analysis, it seems to me that no medical school ought to be graduating people who do not have some basic grasp of science. And a basic element of science is, of course, acceptance of evolution, not obviously in its initial Darwinian form, but modified versions of evolution. I don't see how you can pass a course in human anatomy, physiology, and so on, and still think that this was the way Adam and Eve were constructed 6,000 years ago. There has to be some point at which accepted science needs to be introduced as a criterion for certification in those sciences. That having been said, I don't think that many of us have to come to grips with that. Simply because most of the people who go into those specialties do, in fact, either reject religion or see it as an adjunct to their scientific knowledge rather than something in conflict with it. I'm not sure how far we can push the the curriculum to accept not just alternate views, but highly inflammatory, contradictory views. This is something that I've been grappling with for some time. I used to be I guess, a free speech fundamentalist. I'm now beginning to question, especially given the violence that has appeared on college and university campuses, when we either have people trying to oh, fire university professors for even mentioning the word Marx in class, and we find other people trying to silence uh, right wing, conservative, various sorts of anti intellectual speakers coming onto campus, and other people showing up with placards and picket signs saying, don't let them speak. We've gotten to a point where these sorts of alternatives are, uh, are really causing some very serious difficulties. And I think that there is a tremendous burden, especially on people who are promoters of academic freedom, which is where we started, to come forward and say, enough, enough with the confrontation. Let's see if we can build from the ground up on the basis of mutual respect some kind of way to talk about these issues that is not going to result in sometimes actual physical confrontations. We've seen some of this with the antics of the folks around Jordan Peterson and so on, when he makes his appearances, and almost inevitably there will be people applauding his particular version of a self help group or a self help manual. And there will be others who will take exactly the opposite side, and they yell at one another. They don't talk to one another. And if there is a future role, and I certainly hope there is, for a rejuvenated, reconstructed liberal arts component in higher education, it should start with that. It should start with the idea that you have the right to express your belief, I have the right to express mine, but it has to go further than that. We have to develop a way to talk to one another so that we can make sense of one another, and only then will we be able to do what we came here to do, which was think about the future.
I wholeheartedly agree that we need to speak with each other and not yell at each other if we're going to address the very real issues that we face. We've been talking for quite a while. I want to ask if you could change one thing, either in the university or the college system or in society more broadly, what would it be?
One way or another, I go back, I don't know who said this first. It's often credited to a number of American politicians, but it seems to me it was actually an American sociologist, and I am embarrassed because I can't recall her name. However, she was a social worker in Chicago in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. The moment this is over, it'll immediately pop into my head again. But in any case, her statement that has been repeated frequently since was there is only one cure for the ills of democracy, and that is more democracy. Well, if the institutions of higher education should be anything, it should be models of free speech and free democratic speech. And so, what I would do in the universities and colleges, and ideally everywhere else, but certainly there, would be to democratize. That is to say, get rid of the current inherent adversarial nature of the relations between administration and faculty. Democratize the institution. Give more power to the faculty to determine those things that should be in the domain of the academic world, and let the administrators have their turf, which is to pay the bills to make sure that the snow is cleared in the winter, and if necessary, schmooze with politicians from time to time. But academics should be in charge of the academic world, and that academic world should be itself more democratic. And that would mean things like equal treatment for teachers at all levels, and it should include students as well. There has to be some way to fulfill what the old conservative George Grant once said: the curriculum is the soul of the university. The curriculum. And what I fear about today's institutions is that they have lost their souls. There is no central theme, no central purpose or meaning other than what the market dictates that guides their decisions. I would like to see more democratization so that together we can agree on a common project, and that project must have something to do with learning how our society can and equipping people with the capacity to help in solving what are genuinely existential problems. We are seeing today not only climate change and all sorts of ecological catastrophes, real or in the making, but we're seeing a tremendous set of problems arise economically. Interestingly, we have reduced poverty a great deal, at least in the wealthier nations, but we have exacerbated the gap between the rich and the poor. So that even if you are a middle class person today, you're worried about losing your job, you're worried about not being able to make your mortgage, and so on and so forth. There has to be a healthy political economy. There has to be a healthy biosphere, or anthroposphere as we're calling it now. And only by not just critical thinking, but criticizing the way in which things are done, are we as a species going to be able to thrive and not merely survive, and for some even mere survival has become problematic. So democratize, equalize to some degree, make sure that we have equitable treatment of people within the community, and collectively come to some sort of understanding of what kinds of questions we should be asking and how we should be asking them for the sake of our own well-being and our own survival.
Well, that's a tall order. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I hope that we, as a community, as a country, as a species, as a globe, are up to the challenges ahead.
We
Howard
have no
Doughty,
choice.
indeed. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centreforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centreforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centreforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.